Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la serie de seminarios institucionales del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Muy buenos días y buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Vanessa de la Cruz y estaré moderando este evento. En esta ocasión y en el marco del Día Mundial del Cerebro, el Centro de Investigación en Evaluación y Encuestas se complace en presentar el seminario El Poder de las Artes y la Creatividad en la Promoción de la Salud Cerebral. Muchas gracias, Brian y Dominic, por aceptar la invitación. Este día nos invita no solo a reflexionar sobre la salud cerebral como un componente esencial del bienestar individual y colectivo, sino también nos invita a actuar, a traducir el conocimiento en intervenciones y prácticas que fomenten entornos protectores para el cerebro a lo largo de la vida. Este seminario celebra la convergencia entre ciencia, arte y salud pública, reconociendo que el arte puede fortalecer el bienestar emocional, la conexión social y con ello la salud de nuestro cerebro. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Este seminario contará con traducción simultánea, así que un breve aviso por parte del equipo de traducción.
Muy buenos días, estimado público. Mi nombre es Laura Gómez, que esta mañana será su intérprete de conferencias. Para aquellos que no saben cómo funciona, les digo, en la parte inferior de la pantalla Zoom, por lo general del lado derecho, dice interpretación o servicio de idiomas o lenguaje o interpretation. Ahí ustedes van a hacer clic y les va a permitir dejar audio original, escuchar inglés o escuchar español. Le hacen clic y ya, todo el tiempo van a escuchar español, ya sea de los oradores que hablan español o de la interpretación. Y para quienes están en un iPad o en un teléfono inteligente, igual en la parte inferior tendrán que encontrar los 3 puntitos donde a veces dice más y le hacen clic a los 3 puntitos o en más y les va a aparecer también el servicio de interpretación simultánea. De igual forma pueden elegir audio original, inglés o español. Es únicamente para escuchar. A partir de este momento, nuestro servicio audiovisual va a activar el servicio de interpretación y podrán encontrar el canal de la interpretación simultánea. Muy buen día, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Como panelista nos acompañan el doctor Brian Lawlor y Dominic Campbell, a quienes en unos momentos presentaré. También nos acompaña la doctora Teresa Chamalevi, quien es investigadora del instituto, directora del Centro de Investigación en Evaluación y Encuestas. Gracias. En representación del director general nos acompaña el doctor Tonatiu Barrientos. Tonatiu es médico cirujano y maestro en ciencias en salud en el trabajo por la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana y doctor en epidemiología por la Universidad de Texas en Houston. Realizó estudios de postdoctorado en epidemiología social en la Universidad de Michigan. Actualmente es director del Centro de Investigación en Salud Poblacional del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública, es miembro del Sistema Nacional de Investigadores Nivel 3 y de la Academia Nacional de Medicina de México. Sin más preámbulo, te cedo la palabra, Tonatiu.
Muchas gracias, doctora Vanessa de la Cruz. En nombre del doctor Eduardo Lascano, les doy la bienvenida a este seminario con el que hoy, 22 de julio, celebramos el Día Mundial del Cerebro. El cerebro es el órgano que nos hace humanos, nos permite pensar, planear, calcular, tener sentido del tiempo, pero también nos permite recordar, soñar y olvidar. Las condiciones neurológicas y psiquiátricas superan hoy a cualquier otro grupo de enfermedades crónicas en nuestro país. Trastornos como la depresión o la ansiedad afectan a nuestra población, incluso desde edades muy tempranas, generando una enorme carga de enfermedad y discapacidad. Conforme nuestra población envejece, las condiciones neurológicas y psiquiátricas están cambiando. Enfermedades como el Parkinson, la demencia o el Alzheimer son cada vez más importantes para nuestra población adulta mayor. Por ello, debemos voltear a ver la salud cerebral desde la salud pública, ofreciendo un marco de comprensión y acción integral para comprender, prevenir, detectar, tratar y rehabilitar las condiciones neurológicas y psiquiátricas que están sufriendo las personas. El seminario de hoy cuenta con expertas y expertos internacionales que han dedicado su carrera al estudio de las condiciones neurológicas y psiquiátricas. El tema que nos presentarán es fascinante, pues se enfoca en entender el vínculo entre el arte y la salud cerebral. Es difícil imaginar un acto más complejo que la creación a través de la imaginación. Pero el arte no solo afecta la forma en que pensamos, también afecta la manera en la que abrimos espacios para la creatividad compartida, lugares de encuentro que nos permiten acercarnos, identificarnos y formar comunidad. Múltiples estudios recientes han mostrado el enorme impacto del arte para mantener a nuestro cerebro saludable. Justo de eso hablaremos hoy, de cómo generar salud cerebral a través del arte. Agradezco a la doctora Vanessa de la Cruz Góngora por su liderazgo en este tema tan central y tan importante para la salud pública, y celebro mucho que el CIEE, como centro, esté entrando en esta temática que es tan importante para la salud pública de nuestro país. También agradezco a los doctores Brian Lawlor y Dominic Campbell por dedicar este tiempo para dictar el seminario. Muchas gracias y que tengan muy buen día.
Gracias, Donatio. Nuestro primer ponente es el doctor Brian Lawlor. El doctor Lawlor es profesor Connelly Norman de Psiquiatría Geriátrica y director fundador del Global Brain Health Institute en el Trinity College Dublin de Irlanda. Es psiquiatra especializado en geriatría, con experiencia en demencia, depresión en la vejez, soledad y salud cerebral. Durante más de 30 años ha trabajado en el desarrollo de servicios, la investigación y la atención clínica para personas que viven con demencia. Sus intereses de investigación abarcan desde la detección temprana y prevención hasta ensayos clínicos y evaluación de nuevos tratamientos para la demencia. Ha publicado extensamente en el campo de la demencia y la psiquiatría geriátrica y es miembro del Consejo Mundial sobre Demencia. Posee varios títulos honoríficos y académicos, además de ser doctor en medicina. Es miembro del Colegio Real de Médicos de Irlanda, miembro del Colegio Real de Psiquiatras del Reino Unido, miembro honorario del Trinity College de Dublín y miembro de la Real Academia Irlandesa. Nos va a presentar el tema Generando ondas cerebrales creativas, cómo el arte y la creatividad constituyen una poderosa receta para la salud cerebral. Bienvenido, Brian, y gracias. Adelante.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that kind introduction. And I am delighted and excited to be here with you today to talk about making creative brainwaves, how art and creativity make a powerful prescription for brain health. I work here at the Global Brain Health Institute, GBHI, and the mission of GBHI is to improve brain health and reduce the scale and impact of dementia worldwide. In the pictures, you see the Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. And Vanessa, of course, is one of our alumni, one of our Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. And it's really through our Atlantic Fellows that we transform and work towards reducing the scale and impact of dementia worldwide. So our fellows are interdisciplinary. They come from many different professions, different backgrounds. They include scientists, physicians, psychologists, artists, and creatives. But they come together, they train together to address life course brain health and prevent dementia. I want to point out here at GBHI that we very much embrace art, creativity, and culture for brain health. And here you see some of our fellows involved with dance, with visual arts, with music, with visiting museums, and also singing in choir, all of which are creative activities that improve brain health. And as I said, we very much embrace art and creativity and culture for brain health because we feel that this is a very important way to improve brain health across the life course. And I'm going to tell you more about this during this talk. So really, what I'm going to focus on is the idea of making creative brainwaves, the whole idea of creativity, arts, and culture for brain health. Here's an outline of my talk. First of all, I'll tell you what we mean by art, creativity, and cultural engagement, some definitions. Then I'll talk about brain health, what it is, and what determines our brain health. Then I'll move to discuss how art, creativity, and cultural engagement can improve well-being, but particular brain health, by targeting what matters to us. I'll then discuss the evidence that art, culture, and creativity have benefits for our health, and particularly for our brain health. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about prescribing art, creativity, and culture for brain health. What's the current landscape in that regard? But really, what does the future hold? I'll start with some of the key messages. The first key message really is to say that what matters to people and what determines their brain health is a sense of connection to other people, having purpose or meaning in life, feeling hope, but also achieving the best physical, mental, and social health that you can. Art, creativity, and culture promote and support all of these things, all that matters to people. And for that reason, this is why art, creativity, and culture are a very powerful prescription for our brain health. So I said I'd start with some definitions. Let's look at what we mean by art. Now, art is the expression or application of human creative skills, of our imagination, of ideas or emotions through a particular medium. That medium could be through music, it could be through visual art, or it could be through dance. There are a number of different types of art. You can have participative art, where people participate in painting, drawing, playing a musical instrument, or doing arts and crafts and hobbies. Or you could have receptive art, which is going to a lecture or listening to a webinar like what we're doing right now, going to a concert, to a play, to a museum, to a film, or some similar activity. Essentially, receptive art is a form of cultural engagement. Now, there are many benefits for art, creativity, and culture. They occur across a continuum from positive well-being, positive emotions, to actually prevention of illnesses. For example, arts, creativity, and culture have the potential to actually decrease the risk of people developing dementia, decrease the risk of people becoming frail, but also to specific interventions. For example, artistic or creative interventions for things like Parkinson's disease, for depression, for anxiety, for loneliness. Now, what about creativity? What do we mean by creativity? Well, creativity is producing something novel and something of value. When we talk about creativity, we talk about the big C and the little c. The big C is where people like Picasso or Kahlo have produced great creativity. They've actually changed history. They changed the way we perceive things. The little c really is the everyday creativity that you and I would experience. This is personal to us. It's getting involved in activities that give us pleasure and give us meaning. And this is very, very important for our brain and for our well-being. Now, imagination and creativity are what make us human. Creativity doesn't occur out of the blue. It doesn't necessarily occur spontaneously. It can take time, practice. And for creativity and for creative practice, people need to be given opportunities. However, creativity is potentially for everyone. And very importantly, creativity, it happens in the brain, but is actually very good for your brain when you are being creative. Now, there's an overlap between creativity, creative practice, and art. And creativity and creative practice and creative activities are, in fact, a form of art. And here I've listed a number of different creative practices or activities. For example, engagement with the arts, such as singing, dancing, performing, visual arts, such as design and craft, dressmaking, painting, use of woodwork, literature, for example, reading, creative writing, poetry, getting involved in digital and electronic arts, for example, photography, filmmaking, and graphic design, participation in local, neighborhood, community, and cultural events. All of these are forms of creativity and creative practice. All of them can benefit the brain. There are some myths about creativity, and we need to explode these myths. One of the myths about creativity is that creativity is only for younger people. This is not the case. Creativity does not go downhill after the age of 30. Creativity actually continues and may flourish as we get older. One of the interesting aspects of creativity and the creative brain is that it uses distractibility and knowledge memory that builds up over a lifetime. Now, distractibility and knowledge memory are characteristics of aging and of the creative brain. Another important point about creativity is that it can be relatively preserved even in the presence of different forms of neurodegenerative diseases. There are forms of dementia that affect the front part of the brain, frontotemporal dementia, that sometimes can cause the release of creativity in the back part of the brain. Creativity such as increased ability to paint and create art. But very importantly, in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, creativity can be preserved. And one of the things we have to do for people with dementia, with cognitive impairment, is give them the opportunities to be creative and to express themselves. And unfortunately, sometimes this is not what happens when people develop cognitive impairment. They have less opportunity rather than more opportunity to show their creative side. I just want to say a word or two about attitude and perceptions, because your attitude and how you see things and how you think about things does determine your behavior and very much your health. So if you think positively, you think creatively, this can have an impact on how you feel and on your health. And here's a very good example of this. Clint Eastwood, a very famous American actor and director, aged 93 now, he's still directing movies. But he has a particular attitude that doesn't allow him to think old or think negatively about the fact that he's aged 93. And he says, you don't let the old man in. You keep him out of the house. You have to turn your back on the old murmurer, full of rage and complaints, lacking courage, denying himself that old age can be creative, determined, and full of light and projection. So later in life, you can maintain creativity, but you have to have the right attitude. You have to keep the old man out of the house. Because negative attitudes about aging can have damaging effects on your health. For example, thinking old and thinking negatively about age is associated with you walking more slowly, with you getting the likelihood of getting depressed, but also it predicts a decline in your cognitive ability, your cognitive function. So attitude matters. Having a positive attitude matters to your health. Now, just as your body needs exercise and needs to be stretched to remain healthy and fit, so too does your brain. Your brain needs to be stretched, it needs to be exercised in order to keep it fit and healthy. So this brings me to the concept of brain health. And I want to talk a little bit about brain health and what it is and what determines brain health. So brain health is about achieving the best brain functioning that you can over your life course. Now, brain health is not simply the absence of brain disease, because you can have brain health even if you have dementia, for example. So brain health is getting the most out of your brain. It's about protecting your brain and reducing risks to your brain. We say that there is no health without brain health, because our brain is our most important asset. We have to look after it. Now, very importantly, our brains are plastic. They show what we call neuroplasticity. The brain can grow connections, it can change and adapt in response to stimulation from experience and from the environment. And everyone can improve and achieve their brain health by reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors over their lifespan, but also, very importantly, by challenging their brain. Now, here you see a list of risk factors for brain health across the lifespan, beginning in childhood all the way up to late life. Risk factors such as poverty, pollution, low levels of education, alcohol, poor diet, smoking, traumatic brain injury, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, visual deficits, hearing deficits, heart disease, stroke, depression, social isolation, and loneliness. So these are a range of risk factors that occur across the lifespan that can affect your brain health. But the good news is that many of these risk factors, if not most of these risk factors, are modifiable. There are things that you can do to reduce your risk to protect your brain. And we know that social and cognitive stimulation can build reserve in your brain so that your brain is better able to deal with pathology that occurs or is laid down later in life. And really what I want to focus on is how art, culture, and creativity can help promote, support, and protect your brain, particularly by increasing social and cognitive stimulation to build that reserve in your brain. So what should we do to protect and challenge our brain? So the best approach is to target what matters to you, that matters to you for your health, but particularly for your brain health. And there are three main areas to target that really matter for your brain health. First of all, physical health. Secondly, mental health. And third, social health and engagement with life. Because each of these three areas, these domains, impact or determine your brain health. So from the point of view of physical health, we need to tackle low exercise levels. Aerobic exercise is very effective in terms of boosting your brain health. With regard to mental health, we have to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. And for social health, we have to tackle loneliness and isolation and this lack of stimulation that can occur with loneliness and isolation. We also should boost the emotions that determine well-being and health and our brain health. And when you look across the world, across many different age groups, 4 different emotions keep coming up as determining well-being, health, and brain health. These are feeling hopeful, feeling calm, feeling connected, and feeling determined and having purpose or meaning in life. So feeling hopeful is about agency. It's about having a sense of control over your life. It's about having pathways. Feeling calm is not being anxious. Very important contribution to your mental health. Feeling connected, socially connected, is hugely important to your general health and your brain health. And we know that being determined, having purpose, has huge benefits to your health and to your brain health. So we need to boost the emotions that determine well-being and health, and also target the areas that determine our brain health. And essentially, this is the sweet spot for art, culture, and creativity, because art, culture, and creativity, as I'll discuss with you now, targets the areas that matter for brain health, and also the emotions that determine well-being, health, and brain health. So let's look at the evidence for the benefits of arts, culture, and creativity for our health, our general health, our sense of well-being, and our brain health. First of all, let's look at participatory arts, cultural engagement, and physical health. So this is where dance really stands out. We know that dance improves your gait, it improves your mobility, but also your fitness level, particularly your aerobic fitness level. Dance is also associated with improvement in your gait speed, how quickly you walk, and also your physical activity levels, but it also improves frailty. Interestingly, Participatory arts, engagement in a museum program, for example, has been shown to decrease frailty levels as well. And also museum attendance is associated with less chronic pain and a longer lifespan, lower mortality. So participatory arts, cultural engagement does have benefits for physical health. What about participatory arts and cultural engagements and the benefits for your mental health? Well, we know that singing is associated with an improvement in your mood. It creates positive emotions and a better sense of well-being. Singing, visual and creative arts are also associated with decreasing the levels of loneliness. Arts participation is associated with a decrease in stress and burnout in caregivers. And cultural engagement, particularly museum attendance, for example, is associated with less stress, less depression, lower anxiety levels, but also over time is associated with less cognitive decline and decreased risk of developing dementia. So these are powerful effects for arts and cultural engagement on mental and cognitive health. We also know that art and cultural engagement can boost your sense of connection, which is really important for your health and your brain health. So art and cultural engagement has been shown to increase social connection across many, many different settings. It's associated with a decrease in loneliness. People who participate in art and are culturally engaged have better social relationships. Caregivers who participate have more social connection between themselves. But very interestingly, where caregivers and the care recipients are participating in art or becoming more culturally engaged, there's an improvement in the quality of the relationship between the carer and the care recipient. What about the impact of art and cultural engagement on the aging process? Well, there's some evidence suggesting that there's a potential impact on lifespan and on the rate of aging. For example, there's a slower transition to becoming frail. There's less cognitive decline, and some evidence to suggest that art and cultural engagement may reduce the risk of developing dementia. So there are positive hints from these studies, but these are primarily observational studies looking at people over time. They're not clinical trials, and we would need more evidence to be definitive about this. Now, what about meaning in life? I said that meaning in life is a powerful determinant of health and brain health. We know that art, creativity, and culture can boost your mood and generate positive emotions, but it's also been shown to be associated with having greater meaning and purpose in life. And some of the studies would suggest that this benefit, this dividend for meaning and purpose in life is greater in older people compared to younger people. But it does look like art, creativity, and culture can increase a sense of meaning and purpose in life, which is very important. The purpose in life can be sustained through creativity and creative practices. Creative activities improve the level of depression, anxiety, and loneliness and promote purpose in life. And one of the things that happens for older people who are developing cognitive impairment or early dementia is that purpose in life can decrease before and after the emergence of cognitive impairment, around the time of diagnosis of dementia. But if we can get people with early dementia involved in creative practice, this is a potential opportunity to actually counter this loss of meaning in life, which could be very important. So people with dementia, people who are developing cognitive impairment, need to be offered more, not less, opportunities to be creative and to experience creative activities. I want to say a few words about community art participation and public health initiatives. It's been found that youth-led arts-based community participation, these are young people from different parts of the world, often experienced in areas of conflict, forced migration, and the like. But these youths who experience art-based community projects, they have increased hope, and these activities, this participation helps them imagine a better future for themselves, which is really important. As I mentioned, hope is hugely important for health. There are a number of important and interesting projects now happening around the world, some in the US, some in other parts of the world, looking at the potential for community arts and health-based care. One interesting project is this One Nation, One project happening in the US, which aims to use art to increase community cohesion and health. And I think the future will see more arts and health-based programs in the community that explicitly link art to better health and brain health messages. And I think we're going to see more and more, because of the evidence for art and creativity and culture for health, for these types of programs to develop in the community in an attempt to drive public health approaches to improve the community's general health using arts, creativity, and culture. So if I was to summarize, I think we can say, based on the evidence, that art, culture, and creativity can make a big difference to health and to our brain health. Art, culture, and creativity improve our physical health. It can improve our mental and cognitive health. It gives us a better sense of meaning and purpose in life, and it connects people. People can develop better relationships. And here I've listed all the things that art, culture, and creativity can do for our brain health, from raising hope, promoting agency, giving people a better sense of control over their lives, decreasing anxiety, providing meaning and purpose, helping to process emotions, slower cognitive decline and lowering the risk of dementia, connecting people, improving the well-being of caregivers, promoting self-awareness, and fostering a very, very important value, the value of empathy. So you can see how art, culture, and creativity is a powerful, powerful prescription for brain health. So art, culture, and creativity offers an awful lot to the community and to public health initiatives. There's something in it for everybody. Art, culture, and creativity can be for everybody. It promotes equity and inclusion. It changes the narrative from capacity, from the sense of we can do things as opposed to not do things. It changes the narrative to capacity, not incapacity. It improves health, but also the healthcare environment. It supports carers and caring. It boosts brain health in every way, but also, very importantly, it boosts hope. And as a very famous German visual artist said, Gerhard Richter, that art is the highest form of hope. So perhaps I could leave you with some final thoughts. I hope that I have convinced you that art, culture, and creativity is a powerful prescription, and that if it was a drug, that you would take it for your brain health. Art, culture, and creativity should be widely prescribed for our health and for our brain health. But to make it a mainstream social prescription, I would say that we would need more access, people need more opportunities, and we need more evidence, I think, to support it being used widely, more widely in the community as a social prescription for health and for brain health. I think I'll leave it there, so thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Brian, por esta estupenda presentación. Invito a la audiencia que si tiene preguntas, por favor, lo puedan hacer en la caja de comentarios. Ok, hay un comentario que está en inglés. No sé si lo gusten leer, Brian. Dice, primero que nada, estoy muy contento que este webinar está tomando lugar. Como un fellow en el arte global de medicina, es certificado, aplica teatro y es practicante de la dramaterapia y que le da esperanza. Es- Se pregunta si tú podrías compartir más acerca de cómo en tu experiencia el trabajo disciplinario entre artistas y profesionales de la salud puede ser promovido, em, donde hay muchas barreras y sesgos presentes. Por ejemplo, en México, las artes de terapéuticas y creativas, o las artes en salud, no están siendo reconocidas como profesiones formales. ¿Cómo ha sido esto en tu país?
So that's a great question, and I will try to answer it as best I can. And I think this is a challenge in many, many different countries. I think people working in silos. And I think what we really need to do is try to build connections and bridges between the different disciplines, between arts and medicine, because I think they still are relatively siloed. And this is one of the things that we're trying to do at the Global Brain Health Institute, where we're bringing together people from different disciplines, different professions to work together in the area of brain health and dementia prevention. And we found an extraordinary experiment when we bring artists and creatives into the room with the scientists, with the clinicians. And magic can happen in those settings. But in real life, in practice, those gaps, those barriers exist. And I think we have to just, build the evidence, but try to work collaboratively and cooperatively together as much as possible. Because I think when I talked about community arts and participatory arts and looking at public health approach to arts and health, the only way this is going to work is where if we have true collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration between the artists, the healthcare professions, the health services. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's not just in Mexico. I think the challenge that you have in Mexico is the challenge that we have worldwide. But I think, again, what we need to emphasize are the positives, what art, creativity, and culture can do for brain health, can do for health. I mean, that's a developing evidence base. I think that's very, very important. Also, it sounds to me like in Mexico, you have great strengths in the cultural end of things, in the artistic and creative end of things. But I think it's a question and a challenge to break down these professional silos. And I guess this World Brain Day and this webinar is all about that. It's bringing us together. It's sharing ideas, working together. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the person, it's the individual that we want to help. And the only way we can help is by working across disciplines in a very meaningful way. So, great question. I hope I've answered it a little in some way, but I think we need to do a lot more work in this space.
Gracias, Brian. Hay otras preguntas. No vamos a leer todas por cuestión de tiempo y de Dominic, pero voy a leer algunas. Marta Cortés nos pregunta si es posible revertir o frenar el deterioro cognitivo.
Is the question, is it possible to stop cognitive decline using art and creativity? The evidence suggests that let's say cultural engagement, museum attendance is associated with decreased risk of developing dementia and slower cognitive decline. I would say that it's not going to stop cognitive decline, but I think it may be able to slow the trajectory. And I think also, and very importantly, I think for people, with cognitive impairment, living with dementia, there's very good evidence that it creates more positive emotions, it improves quality of life, it gives them a better sense of meaning. Also, from the point of view of the care, there's benefits to the care as well. So all in all, I think there are benefits in terms of emotional well-being, for sure. The evidence for cognitive decline and slowing the cognitive decline is mostly observational. But in terms of dealing with a condition like Alzheimer's disease, I think I would not think that arts creativity is an intervention that's going to actually stop cognitive decline. But being realistic, slowing the trajectory, improving quality of life, I think these are very, very meaningful endpoints and targets for intervention.
Gracias, Brian. Hay otra pregunta, dice, ¿cuál es el impacto de las artes en la depresión o ansiedad? ¿Hay alguna técnica artística especial que es mejor? Por ejemplo, la pintura al óleo, en acuarela o en acrílico. Gracias.
Okay, so again, a very good question. I mean, the evidence is that, art, involvement in art, certainly visual art, is what we're talking about here, can improve mood, create positive emotions, decrease anxiety levels, also decrease loneliness. In terms of specific forms of art techniques, I don't believe there is evidence for one or the other. What I would be looking to do is to personalize the intervention as much as possible, and thinking about what does a person want to do, and whether they want to work with, acrylic, watercolor, or oil. I think that's really what I would focus on. I would say, though, that participating in visual arts practice has benefit for mood, for depression, anxiety, creates positive emotions. I don't think that the actual specific technique is going to make that much difference. I think it really depends really on what the person wants to work with and what they enjoy working with.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta es, ¿tiene algún ejemplo de las artes aplicadas a los adolescentes con depresión?
There are many examples of art being used for adolescent depression, anxiety. I mean, in fact, the area for arts interventions really has been, I guess, most prolific for child and adolescent mental health. So I think a very, very positive impact in those areas for children and adolescents getting involved in creative practice, creative activities, particularly art.
Y la última pregunta que voy a tomar de esta sesión es, ¿cómo llevar a la práctica esta indicación en población de estratos socioeconómicos bajos, en donde no hay medicinas ni siquiera agua de consumo humano disponible?
Again, this is an excellent question, and I think that if you remember at the end of the talk, I talk about opportunities and access, and I think this is a question that always comes up, and I think that creativity, arts, culture is potentially should be available to everybody, and there is an equity issue, and we have to make sure that people aren't left behind. And I mentioned about people with dementia who could be left behind, but also poor people could be left behind. Because poor people aren't necessarily attending museums or galleries, and so this is where the idea around participatory arts and community arts, I think, comes in. I think this is where we have to level the playing field and make sure that art, culture, and creativity is for everybody, and it's for everybody's health and well-being. And I think that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. But I think it's an important point that's been made, that there's an equity issue here around access, and it's also a point about brain health in general, because when we talk about for brain health, one of the risk factors of brain health, for example, and Vanessa knows an awful lot about this in terms of nutrition, but when you're poor, and you're wondering where you're going to have money to put food on the table, you may not necessarily be thinking about a Mediterranean diet for your brain health. So this is where we need population level interventions, to deal with these issues. We can't leave it down to an individual. Can they afford to go to a museum or a gallery or get involved in creative practice or not? Everybody should have the opportunity, and this is where, at a country level, a population level, at a systems level, people should be given the opportunity to be able to be creative, to attend creative activities, to get involved in art and creativity across the life course, because if they do, it's good for their health and it's good for their brain health.
Gracias, Ryan. Tienes muchas felicitaciones y excelente presentación. A continuación voy a presentar al siguiente panelista. Al término de la presentación del siguiente panelista, vamos a hacer una serie de preguntas dirigidas a Dominic y después un panel discussion con los dos panelistas. El siguiente panelista es Dominic Campbell. Dominic Campbell es productor cultural, es cofundador de Creatividad Internacional y desde 2020 dirige el programa de arte y participación cultural de la Fundación Irlandesa de Cuidados Paliativos. Anteriormente, se desempeñó como director artístico del Beltane Festival, la celebración nacional de envejecimiento creativo de Age and Opportunity, así como del Festival de San Patricio, el principal evento cultural de Irlanda. Es Atlantic Fellow y miembro del Global Brain Health Institute y actualmente impulsa las iniciativas Creative Brain Week y artsandbrain.com orientadas a promover una distribución equitativa del pensamiento creativo. Como productor cultural con una sólida trayectoria, está comprometido con el uso de la creatividad y la celebración como estrategias para la transformación social, con el propósito de que más personas puedan vivir mejor y por más tiempo. Nos va a presentar el tema creatividad, cultura, arte y salud. Muchas gracias, Dominic, y bienvenido.
Buen día. Gracias. And it is so lovely to be here. So let me share my screen and we hope the technology works. Is good? Okay. And
Sí, se ve bien.
we'll begin. Good. Okay. Hopefully that is the difficult part. I am very aware that you've been sat still, so I want to invite you to join me in a little dance. So I'm going to invite you to just breathe in wherever you might be. Breathe in. And then breathe out. You can blow at the screen. Breathe in again. Fill your lungs and breathe out again. And one last time, breathe in and breathe out. So that is a little dance that we've just made all around the world through the magic of Zoom, of this technology. What amazing technology we have, and that we're lucky enough to be able to do this. So I'm going to talk about creativity, culture, arts and health. I'm going to echo some of the things that Brian has said. I'm going to talk and share, hopefully, some of our current understanding, but also some of the processes, some of the ways that we are trying to use this knowledge and awareness. But I have to say that I start in a very different place from Brian. So I am very concerned, and have been all of my working life, in how people make knowledge, how they understand the world that they live in, and how in the process of making knowledge and understanding, they also gain for themselves meaning, value, and purpose. So to begin with, I need to tell you a little bit about my history. So back when I was about 20 years old, this is how I made understanding of the world. I built carnival costumes in the Caribbean. And this might seem a very long way from talking about arts and health, but I really think the two are very connected. So what I learned from these projects was that if you put on a costume, if you assume an identity, perform, you get to understand what it feels like to be somebody else. If you work with many, many people to make a big costume or many costumes, you understand how to collaborate. And if you're making decisions about what that artistic costume might be, you are having a voice in the world. And collectively, these are the things that sustained people for whom the world was in opposition, people who were enslaved, who were in the Caribbean, for hundreds of years. This ability to sense what it was like to be someone else, to sense what it was like to have hope and possibility and potential. And I took that knowledge into my working life as I got older, and the projects I ran became bigger and more complicated. And in my 30s, I found myself in charge of Irish Christmas, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. And normally that event, which is the geographic center of a global celebration, it's talked about in terms of number of people that attend and then the amount of money. But you can also think very clearly, and we did, about how that event is about health and well-being. So, for example, we would commission artists to work with young people from difficult postcodes, from difficult parts of the city, from poor parts of the city, so they could dress as a king or a queen, and they would walk down the main streets of the city and they would be celebrated. They would own the city, they would be seen, they would be visible. The festival is all about how we imagine the place that we live in and how we can change the place that we live in through imagination. So we would put events in different parts of the city to encourage audiences to look at them in a different kind of way. And it is hugely about identity. It's about who belongs and who do we think of as Irish, who is part of our family and our extended family. And we played with that in all sorts of different ways. So that's where I wanted to start. I wanted to start by giving you a sense of the tools that we're using in this work. But I want to give you a second way of thinking about this. I'm about to show you a picture. I want you to think about how, if you were a patient coming to this building, what it would make you feel. So what would it feel like if you were a patient and you came to this occupational therapy department? Make you feel good? Would it make you feel valued? What would it make you feel? So this is the very same building. Once it's been visited by my friend Kunle Adewale and his friends and some paint. The same building. The mental health institution in Lagos, Nigeria. Before paint, with paint and imagination. And I think it tells a very different story to the patients. Now, this is not something that is unique to Lagos or to this building. It's something that we do all across the world. This is a residential care setting in the UK, in England. This is a corridor for a place that supports older people in Ireland. This is a hospital in Dublin. And every single building tells a different story to the people that use them about how important they are, about how valuable they are to us, about what we think is important in the world that we've built around them. And also, they are opportunities that we do or don't use to stimulate, to build health. So I share these because this work for me is all about working with the senses, with sight and sound and smell and touch and taste towards healing. And it's also working with those things that affect our senses. A sense of safety, visibility, whether we are accepted or whether we are rejected. Sexism, rageism, racism, being heard, and even, as Brian was saying, becoming older, or those illnesses that also come with a stigma attached. And what we're working towards is solutions that work for individuals, but also for groups, community of place or of interest, or a society, or a system. We're working through national plans and education. And what we are increasingly doing, we're getting increasingly good, I think, at this, is we are making knowledge from a marriage of science and art. So often people might talk about words, they might talk about arts and health or creative health. In the sciences in neurology, they might talk about neuroaesthetics. They might talk about the neuroscience of emotional creativity as research. And these words and phrases are becoming more popular, more widely used. What this work is mostly interested in, unlike biomedical approaches, is not how does an illness develop, but how is health made? And who makes health? How do we create the conditions in which health can flourish? So we're starting from a very different point. As Brian might say when he thinks about public health, not how do we pull people out of a river, but why do they fall in? So we're looking at what is it that makes people flourish? And when you start to think about systems, healthcare systems, this gets to be really interesting. So traditionally, in a biomedical model, you might build a healthcare system by defining the illness, then defining a cure for that illness, and then defining a system of care. So for example, we define this illness as cancer, we define a cure for cancer, and then we define a system of cure. In fact, we get more and more specific. We define this cancer as a particular type of cancer, leukemia. We define a cure for leukemia and a system of care for leukemia. Or we define this illness as Alzheimer's, not even as Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia or vascular dementia, a smaller section of an overall illness. And then we define a cure for that and a system cure for that. But in the work that I do, we think slightly differently. So we think about how do we stimulate an individual, regardless of who they are, how they are. How does that individual who becomes excited and stimulated and interested, how do they become a catalyst in their community? And how does that inform systems and processes so that over time, sometimes long period of time, it propagates. It almost grows in the same way that forests do. So it's a very different way of thinking. This work, I think, exists in the middle of a series of a Venn diagram. So it's about arts, it's about health, but it's also about individual development processes, for instance, education. Brian was talking about the Global Brain Health Institute, or systemic developments like city planning and health strategy. And I start there because that gives us a basis for looking at examples. So why is this kind of thinking, this kind of format, this kind of approach so helpful? Well, it's because in a modern healthcare system, like the one in SIM, like the one in Mexico, you're facing a series of very complex challenges. So for instance, you might be dealing with something which is psychosocial, biomedical and behavioral and specific to place. It might be something like the impact that is collectively known as the impact of exposomes. So health challenges like the quality of air and water and education and conflict and socioeconomic issues that affect individuals and also last for generations, or, and it's something that Brian and myself deal with in Ireland where we live, the complexity for health of trying to support aging populations. So yes, that's about people who are increasingly physically frail, perhaps. It's also about people who find it more difficult to use existing methods of transportation, and therefore they become isolated, partly because they're physically frail, but also because the transport systems are challenging. And so is that a healthcare issue, or is that a Department of Transport issue? So they are complex challenges. And so it's valuable, I think, to take a creative approach, not only to the individual engagement and activity, but also to scale that up and think about those implications. And so when I do these talks, because they come from the arts, from the cultural sector, as a cultural producer, very often people say, tell me about evidence. But I'm lucky with people like Brian Lawler, who acknowledges that there is already lots of evidence. There is an increasing amount of evidence being brought together and connected. So for example, at the end of this year, The Lancet will produce a global series on the health benefits of the arts. And when it was announced, Jeremy Farrar, the chief scientist at the WHO, acknowledged that for too long we've seen science and arts as separate, but they weren't always so. And one of the reasons that I start by talking about Carnival is that in people's cultures all around the world, culture has always or often had a health-making benefit. And health-making has always been and continues to be partly an art. So WHO is one of the organizations that started to bring lots and lots of different types of research together. The WHO Europe's Network Synthesis Report is the most downloaded report that they produced from 2019. Expert groups are building on that, so there is evidence being made in research areas. But that evidence now, in the last few years, has started to inform the shape of things like national development plans. So online you can find things like the National Arts in Hospitals Guidance, which came out in the UK the last month. You can find specific health programs for specific kinds of illness, creative health and dementia pathways from the National Centre for Creative Health. Or in Ireland, not even a month ago, 2 weeks ago, the first ever strategic action plan for creative arts and health, which is produced by a number of different departments working collaboratively. But personally, I'm more interested, I'm more involved in, I'm more experienced and knowledgeable about making evidence by practice. And one of the things I find really useful to revisit is this quotation from Richard Smith, who at the time was the editor of the British Medical Journal, and he was trying to make an argument that 0.1% of the UK, the National Health Service budget, should be spent on the arts. And the reason, he said, is that at some point in people's lives, they will have a bad diagnosis. Their narrative will change. And if health is about adaptation, understanding, and acceptance, then the arts may be more potent than anything that medicine has to offer, because the art teaches you to make a new way, to create a new process. So, as Brian said so well, what kind of arts and what kind of creativity are we talking about? Well, we're talking about all sorts of arts and all sorts of creativity. You can make direct correlations between some kind of arts practice and some kind of health issues, but it's better to think about them, I think, in a different kind of way. So all kinds of art, any kind of art, dancing, crafts, music, visual arts, but we think about them in a slightly different way. So this is the work of Tom Smith. Tom Smith was trying to come up with a framework for what he meant by arts and health. And he said, these are projects which are a little bit art, a little bit health. They're also partly about individuals and partly about social. And depending on their intention, there will be slightly more in one area than another. They're about groups, they're about supporting care, they're about creativity, they're about unity. With the GBHI team, we made up a slightly different framework. We started to think about what was the art doing. And so I'm going to give you some illustrations and some examples, and I'm going to use this framework to do that. And then I'm going to talk about some very recent examples about how we are applying this knowledge in practice. So I'm going to talk about arts, creativity, and connection, engagement, arts, creativity, and research, knowledge making, exploration, arts, creativity, and promotion, advocacy, arts, creativity, and equity, the art of transformation. And what do they have that makes each of those slightly different? So, engagement. Engagement might be something like a dance class for older people. Madhkesh Mazga here in New York City, who runs dance classes every day of the week for older people. And what they have in common is that they are about group engagement. What they do is support people to do, for instance, movement as therapy, but people do it because they are part of a group. They are sustained in doing that because they're part of a group. And it's more than a singular benefit. It has multiple benefits. The creativity is sometimes a thing through which we can talk about things that we find difficult. And they come in all sorts of shapes and forms. This is a VR headset project in Nigeria, which gives people, older people in residential care, a sense of the world that they physically can no longer visit, and it helps stimulate the neuroplasticity that Brian mentioned. This is a project that was made with young trainee surgeons, and the surgeons were invited to bring objects that they were that they felt were precious. So the jumper that they would not throw away, a pair of trousers that they kept mending. And the artist, Celia Pym, invited them to mend these, to sew them together, but also to think about what can be mended and what and when it is no longer possible to mend things. And so as an educational process, as a pedagogy for students, the art had a really critical sense in helping them think about those difficult decisions that the surgeon makes and the fact that people are organic, not everything can be fixed. Arts, creativity and research is really, I think, about two things. On the one side, it's about thinking about what is a research tool. So something like photo voice. Photo voice is a research strategy where people are given cameras to document their own experience. It might be a camera that's given to people who are spending time in a hospital, or people to document their own lives. And photo voice is increasingly sophisticated about what do those pictures tell us? What do the keywords that people use tell us about their experience? And how do we use that information to influence the healthcare provision we've got? Alongside of that is the increasing involvement of people in research. So Willie Gilder is a journalist, a lover of rock and roll music, who also is living with a diagnosis of dementia, an Alzheimer's diagnosis, sorry. And he has worked with a group in Scotland where they are finding ways to express their own lived experience in order to shape the kind of care that is offered to them. So arts, creativity and research is partly about whether the research is made with, by or for the patient. It's also about the type of tools. Advocacy, I think we saw lots and lots and lots of this during the pandemic. So we would see the police service in Kerala dancing to encourage people to wash their hands, or art forms in Bangladesh that were trying to find traditional ways of communicating. I think everybody on this call will be very familiar with the use of video and internet and YouTube to carry messages. So My Brain Robbie, for example, is a project that began in France, which is a little animation about a young brain and how that brain can stay healthy. And it uses cartoons to encourage people to or encourage young children to find ways to keep their brain healthy. And especially in Ireland, there seems to be an ever increasing amount of festivals where celebration is used as a strategy to encourage people to try out new ways of maintaining their health, new ways of stimulating their brain, new ways of thinking about what makes us healthy. In one of my previous roles, I ran a festival called Bealtaine Festival, which was mentioned in the introduction. And the interesting thing about Bealtaine Festival was its scale. So by the time that I left that in 2013, 20% of the population over 65 in Ireland were involved in some way in the festival. It had made ideas about aging and ideas about how to keep your brain healthy while you aged and the role of creativity. It had made them normal. They were everywhere. They were easy to find. Which brings me to the last bit. So transformation. And to think about creativity, arts, culture, and transformation, we really have to think a little bit about this. We have to think about if we improve the access to biomedical care, but that care is in an environment that negatively impacts health, or it's in a community that is in opposition to health making or stigmatizes the illness. So, for example, Alzheimer's and dementia. People don't want to talk about it. It's not an easy conversation. So the society and its own culture, the culture of that society is making the illness worse. It is illness making. We think a lot about this. We think about this in terms of transformation. And what we realized was that no traditional healthcare service was ever going to scale enough to deal with these complex problems. That what we really needed was behavioral change on a society level. And that to do that, we needed to work through culture. We needed a cultural change. So for the rest of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've been doing that. One way that we've been doing that is working through Creative Brain Week. So Creative Brain Week is a seminar. It brings together artists and scientists and researchers and people with lived experience of illness and disease and all sorts of medical practitioners. And it brings them together in celebration. It brings them together to look at the things that they do well. It brings them together to stimulate by exposing them to art or to new science and into conversation. It began in Ireland 4 years ago in Trinity College with Brian and his team. And then over the last 2 years, it started to expand around the world. And so I wanted to include this in this conversation to talk about what we're learning from that and how it's happening. So currently, Creative Brain Weeks have happened in India and Botswana, in Australia, Egypt and Singapore. And each of them takes an asset-based community development approach. So the team in each area works to their strengths, whether they are strong as a researcher, as an advocate, or as a creative person. Each of them brings their expertise and their access, and that meant that the difference between countries and venues wasn't perceived as a loss. We weren't looking at what does this community lost. We were looking at an abundance of knowledge. So already many forms of success are appearing, and we're starting to feed that back. What's important, I think, is that this development process is working at the speed of trust. I'm going to touch a little bit on some of what we're learning. So for example, in Cairo in Egypt, the program there is led by Mohammed Salama, Professor Salama. Professor Salama is a neurologist. He is very much an academic research professor. And what surprised him about the Creative Brain Week in Cairo was how it blurred the relationship between the university and communities. They found lots of fantastic examples in Cairo and in northern Egypt of arts-based practices, and they were able to make these new relationships between the university and the communities. In Brisbane, Australia, one of the things that Kim Nguyen and Juanita Hila said is, in Brisbane, we feel like we're very far away from things, and yet there's extraordinarily brilliant expertise. And so they took their audiences on a journey. They spent 1 day in the art gallery. They spent 1 day in the Brain Institute. They once spent 1 day in the business development agency. And what's happened from that is that the differences between those institutions have started to blur. The knowledge-making process have started to connect. In Singapore, it began with the Art College, and the Art College looked at how do they connect with the sciences of Singapore, but also how do they connect with the lived experience of illness in Singapore, with diverse communities. In Botswana, Lingali Malanza was keen that her students became expertise and ambassadors who took messages about how to make brain health into community, into the godnas, into the villages, and brought back the knowledge from those villages into the university. In India, they began with a really simple question. How do we start to improve brain health through arts and culture in a country of 1 billion people? And the decision was that they started small. They start with a small group of about 20 people. And conversation by conversation, they're looking to cut across disciplines to deal with these complex problems, which are not just as simple as the way that we have traditionally thought about health. And in Argentina, we started 4 years ago in a very different place. So I am delighted that today, on Global Brain Health Day, we are launching this online video that records the project that we've developed over 4 years in San Juan in Argentina with multiple partners. This is a multimodal approach to making brain health in complicated communities, in communities that are socially, economically poor, that are impacted by the lasting impact of toxicity and mining. And to do this, we brought together many different partners. BrainLab, the University Adolfo Ibáñez, GBHI, Atlantic Institute, and musicians. But we began by asking ourselves, in this place, what is there that is an asset? In this place that everybody perceives as difficult and complicated and challenging, what are the assets? And we realized that the assets of this place were that there are very many young people. There are very many lively, energetic, vibrant young people. So we started to think, how can we treat those young people as an asset, and how can we work them? And we realized that there were also artists, there were musicians, there were puppet makers. And so what we've done over 4 years is work with the artists and the puppet makers and the young people to bring brain health messages to those communities through existing cultural forms, using engagement and joy and fun to educate people, and knowing that those young people bring their parents. They sit at the back of the room, they pick up the brain health messages, they become ambassadors and contributors to these projects. And we are learning as we go, in exchange with each community, that the education is a two-way process, that that each person that we work with teaches someone else, and that we need to make that happen because we are dealing with these complicated challenges which are not so simple, but will take a generation or 2 generations to solve. And so our healthcare system is about children and guitarists and puppeteers who work with researchers and health and education expertise to inform the regional and national departments of health, and are going on to become apprentices and ambassadors internationally. And so we think, in fact, we know what we are learning from this project, is that collaboration is critical, that this is about how do we take the best expertise from scientists and the best practice from artists and the best healthcare research and the best community development and find a way to blend them all together. Thank you for the chance to talk to you today, and I very much look forward to trying to answer any questions that you might have.
Muchas gracias, Dominic, por la excelente presentación. Les invito a generar sus preguntas en la tabla o en el cuadro de comentarios. Hay un comentario, está en inglés, te lo voy a leer en español. En México existe una reserva cultural muy rica, con múltiples prácticas comunitarias que sin embargo han sido desplazadas en nombre del multiculturalismo o por distintos fenómenos locales. ¿Cómo pueden las instituciones formales tender puentes efectivos hacia esa reserva cultural, usándola como agente para promover la salud comunitaria, a pesar de las restricciones materiales, como la falta de presupuesto, personal, estructuras administrativas en silos o incluso voces políticas? Por ejemplo, en la Ciudad de México existe un proyecto comunitario llamado Pilares, donde se imparten talleres de prácticas artísticas, pero no se ha establecido ninguna alianza con el sector salud. O bien, ¿cómo podría una práctica cultural existente, una festividad o carnaval, por ejemplo, incorporar un enfoque de arte y salud? Creo que son muchas preguntas en una, pero adelante, Dominic.
Ulysses Moreno Serrano, thank you for your question. I can't, so my knowledge of history and place is limited, and so I can't talk specifically to place, but what I can do is talk about examples from other places with which I'm more familiar. So the first thing I think is to realize that the funding often changes. Funding has fashions. Resources come and go. Cultural engagement is continuous. So the reason for talking about the carnival in the Caribbean at the top of my talk is that carnival continued for hundreds and hundreds of years before there were resources, before there were any grants, before there was budget. And that in and of itself, that practice had a healthcare benefit. I think there is a tendency to think about either or. And for me, these are yes and answers. That what is the reason in San Juan that we spent a long time looking at what is the asset of this community before we went young people, is because the tradition has been to look at those communities as missing and lacking. This isn't to be frivolous about the challenges, but we need creativity in the questions that we ask, because otherwise we are repeating the same solutions and we are limited by how we can get to solutions. We inherit the services, the practices of our grandparents. In Ireland, I live in the healthcare system that was dreamt of by my great-grandfather. And it's fantastic. It's really good at fixing broken bones. It's really good at some things. Other things it's awful for. And for some people, it's really not helpful for. So I invite you to try and think differently about what you are looking at, and to see, is there a way that you can work with the existing traditions that survive and the new knowledge from healthcare services and find a way that they can connect. I'll stop there.
Gracias, Dominic. Hay otras preguntas. Dice, gracias por la presentación. Tengo 3 preguntas como prevención. ¿Cuál sería la actividad contraria a la creatividad en el arte? ¿Cuál evento o situación de vida más común es el que limita la creatividad? ¿Y cuál es la actividad artística más recomendable y accesible?
I love questions. That's where I really have to think. What is excellent? It's okay, Laura. I'm very impressed by your ability to translate. When you asked about what's the most accessible, I am reminded of working with people in residential care who had fairly advanced, who were living with a fairly advanced Alzheimer's. And we used to think about dance how could you make dance with people that were really, their motor functions might be going, they certainly couldn't get out of the chair on their own. And we came up with this, that actually that was a choreography, or this. There were tiny little movements. So there is so dance is one. If your body is in any way able to move, you can make dance. Song is often something that people can access, but also, as Brian said, sometimes it's about making, sometimes it's about listening. When we first started working in Argentina, I did 4 days of talking with healthcare workers about arts and health and how it might work. And at the end of it, I said, I'm going to give you a challenge. I would like you to go and do one small thing. Tell me one small thing that you're going to do next. And somebody said, I'm going to read all the books you recommended. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Somebody else said, I'm going to take a plant, like a green plant, into work, because my office is not really stimulated, and I think plants would be great. And somebody that worked in a hospital said this fantastic thing. She said, when it's quiet in my hospital, and it's never quiet in my hospital, I'm going to go around to all the waiting rooms and I'm going to tune the television, and I'm going to tune it off the news, because they're all tuned to the news and it's like big, bad news. And they're going to find the gardening program or the music programs. We're going to tune it to that, because we think that will change the quality of people's experience in the house. So that's the first thing. What was the life limiting? What's the life issue that limits creativity?
Yes. Sí. ¿Cuál evento o situación de vida más común limita la creatividad?
I think it might be, to talk to Brian, isolation. So in this city that I live in, quite often what happens is people move around the city as they get older, and they end up living somewhere and their partner dies. So for even in the country. So I've been working recently with a men's group in a very rural part of Ireland, and people move to that part of Ireland because it's beautiful. It's so visually, it's got sea and mountains, and they move there when they retire, and that's fantastic. They're going to do that's lovely. And then one person dies, and they realize that they don't know anybody, that they are living in this beautiful place where they have no easy access to family and friends. And so I think the thing that happens in people's lives, and the thing that you can address earlier, is connection, social connection. And the way that we do that is through groups and through making it easy for people to meet new people, or as easy as we possibly can. Okay, what was the first question again? Prevention? What's the activity?
La actividad contraria a la creatividad en el arte.
Time, really. Not allowing yourself the pleasure of doing this. So in the work that's about to come out in the Lancet, one of the arguments that they are starting to make is very different from what we've done so far. They are drawing learning from the health developments of the last 40 years. And they are thinking about what's been really significant. And so they've looked at eating, nutrition. How did it become possible? How did nutrition and healthy eating become a thing that's everybody's aware of? Exercise. How did exercise become a thing that's ubiquitous, that everybody now knows that if you exercise a little bit more, you'll be a little bit healthy? And they're thinking about, how do you make practice or enjoyment of art like that, ubiquitous? So 5 steps to art making. And I think those are the kind of really interesting thing for the next phase, maybe the 4th wave, some people have said, of public health. More questions if we have time.
Sí, fue muy interesante su presentación. Muchas gracias por compartirla. ¿Tienen experiencias? Esta pregunta es para ambos. Empleando estas intervenciones en prevención de adicciones. ¿Y podría compartir cuál ha sido algún desafío que tuvieron que enfrentar para insertarse en las comunidades y cómo lo lograron? Particularmente, bueno, yo podría anexar ahí, particularmente en México se viven episodios de violencia social y creo que las artes podrían entrar en este setting.
Brian, would you like? You have, I think, more experience of me than working with addictions, and I have some thoughts on social violence.
I've no specific experience with addiction and the use of creativity and arts. I mean, obviously, I have a lot of as a psychiatrist, I have a lot of experience with addiction and treating with addiction, alcohol abuse, dependence. But I do think, you know, that there's a very important role for creativity and arts in the treatment of addiction. And most people with addiction, I mean, there are huge complex issues driving addiction, and you can't generalize. But there's often related to trauma and huge issues around shame, and I think certainly creativity and arts can be a way in to try and deal with some of the issues, some of the root causes of addiction, and my kind of anecdotal experience is when dealing with people where, as a standard psychiatrist, you know, in trying to get people to open up or talk about trauma, it can be very, very difficult, no matter how skilled you are. But it can be amazing where a person who's experienced trauma and has issues with addiction, in working with an artist and with a creative, actually can open up more easily. So I feel that again, one of the gaps, one of the difficulties is the distance between the artist, the creative, and the person who's actually delivering arts-based interventions for somebody, let's say, with addiction or trauma, and the healthcare system and the standard the practitioner like myself. And I think that's really what we need to work on, is how to be able to collaborate, work together. That the psychiatrist can work with the artist, with who's involved in treating somebody with addiction, for example, or trauma, and that can be back and forth and exchanges and collaboration. I just don't see enough of that.
I can add to that. So over the last 3 years in Creative Brain Week in Dublin, we've been very lucky in that we have been able to help people who are nurse educators come to Dublin and meet each other. And so they would run nurse training programs in Nepal, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in various places around the world. And some of them had no experience about arts and creativity, and they got very interested in what it was and how it worked and what it could do and whether they could bring it into their education process. And part of the conversation we've had with some of those people has been about where health gets made and where health gets limited isn't in the hospital or the healthcare system. It's in where people live. And some of those people are working in places that are so complicated and challenged that nobody knows where to begin. They can't think where to begin. It seems that people are stuck in an endless cycle of violence now. And so what we are doing at the moment with that group is trying to develop a very, very simple training program, which is for entry-level nurse practitioners for themselves, so that creativity can, or arts can be part of self-care, of supporting them in their own resilience. It's tools for them that they might also use with other people. And the reason we're doing that is that we think that is one place to begin, that it requires a long-term investment. And when we started this, people got very stuck on the idea of a curriculum and a big top-level curriculum. And then they realized that there were small, tiny interventions, small micro decisions, and that the micro decisions cumulatively were transformational. So they were about people recognizing for themselves where they were already creative, that creativity brought joy into their lives, and that joy was a hope-making tool, and hope-making was a healthcare tool. And so it's a long process that doesn't have necessarily a direct correlation, but there are definitely ways to create what we think of as at the moment as a quantum process of arts and health making.
Gracias. Siguiente comentario es, considerando la salud en el curso de vida, ¿cómo promover las artes en los jóvenes cuando el uso de teléfonos inteligentes y redes sociales no solo no está regulado, sino el tiempo frente a pantalla es mucho más que el que recomienda la OMS? ¿Cómo impulsar programas o políticas para insertarse en el sector educativo? Para ambos.
Yes,
In
I
the
can.
last
I
creative,
can. Oh,
you go?
yeah, go ahead, Dominic. Go ahead.
I was thinking in the last Creative Brain Week, we touched on this. We had researchers from the National University of Galway who are part of a European group who are looking at the impact of mobile phone use on the development of young people. We matched that with a researcher who has the largest study of kindness. And kindness is an active process. And it was really fascinating, really interesting, and I think really potentially rich in the future to think about those two things. That we know, for instance, that people who volunteer stay healthier for longer. And it's partly because the act of giving, of contributing, is a way of having a sense of meaning, value, and purpose. And one way of thinking about the arts is that it's a gift. You make something that you give away to other people. So perhaps where we need to start is by thinking about gifts. What is the way by which young people recognize that they have gifts that they have to offer other people? Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to solve that problem today. Brian.
Well, I guess, I mean, it's a huge challenge, this issue of I suppose, young kids being on social media and gaming, and I guess the link with loneliness and increasing anxiety that we're seeing in this younger generation. And I think we need to, raise awareness about the benefits of creativity and arts, and push very, very hard, in the educational system. But I think there's also an opportunity to look at some of the aspects of, I guess, social media and online usage, and maybe try reframe it and rethink it in a more positive way, because obviously too much activity on social media can be harmful, but there are ways that if it's reframed and rethought, there can be benefits, and there are ways to rethink it and relook at it. So it may not necessarily all be bad, but I do think we need to kind of look at I guess creativity and arts as an antidote to loneliness and isolation in kids. I mean, this is happening an awful lot, and I think it really is a huge job of work, I think, that we have to do with parents, with kids, but also with teachers in this area. But I think creativity, arts, has a very important role to play, and we need to get it back in there. Sometimes, I think children are streamlined in a particular way, into science or into one particular way, if they don't seem to be showing proficiency in one thing or the other. And I think it's probably better for people to be more generalists and to encourage them to just be the little C, to explore creativity throughout their childhood and adolescence. But I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in the educational system on this.
Gracias. Aquí hay un comentario y pregunta, dice, los que no tenemos creatividad, ¿hay oportunidad de desarrollarla o es algo con lo que se nace?
Well, I'll start maybe, and Dominic can continue. I mean, I think we are all creative in our own ways. I mean, I think I talked about the big C and the little c, but I think we all have the potential and the capacity to be creative, and I think we have to give ourselves the opportunity and the space to do that. As I was mentioning earlier, sometimes people are streamed in particular ways, and sometimes at school your creativity can be almost beaten out of you. If a teacher may say, that the other person is a very good artist, you're not so good at art. But in fact, maybe you need other opportunities, other experiences to develop that creative side. So I think it's more that we all have the potential to be creative, that we and we just have to help people explore it, develop it, experience it more. And particularly if people experience the benefits of creative activities, that little C, they will be encouraged to continue this throughout their lives, and that creativity can be very helpful in terms of relationships, problem solving, work, all the things that are going to be important as they mature and grow. So I think it would be, I think we got to stop. I think it's a bit of a myth to say that you're either born creative or not. I think we all have that capacity. We just have to nurture it and grow it and develop it and give people the opportunities to express it.
I add to that I think a lot of it is to do with what people are told. They're told they're not creative. Every child I have ever met is incredibly creative. They make the world up in the way that they want it to be. They're constantly inventing. They're constantly being creative because they are trying to understand how the world works. And creativity is tied up with how we ask questions, how we decide what the question is that we want to pursue, and what we do. I think when people tell me about I'm not creative, I had an uncle who was, I'm not creative. He's a very shy man. I'm not creative. I'm not creative. And then he would draw me a map of how a car engine worked. And it was incredibly beautiful and incredibly aesthetically pleasing and really considered. Very beautiful thing. I think also if you have chance and you have access to TED Talks, listen to Ken Robinson on education and creativity. It's a really fantastic TED Talk, which basically says we developed an education system that was about making people a certain kind of way. We designed it by data manufacture, so they were educated by data manufacture, and it was a very industrialized system because we wanted a certain kind of person at a certain point in time. And so that system kind of educated the creativity out. But now we live in a very different world, in a very different global landscape. And one of the things that we need to educate and encourage is creativity. So maybe we need to look very carefully about how we do that, how we create the conditions in which more people's creativity can flourish. And then finally, I think it's about practice. It's about allowing yourself and giving yourself permission to explore your creativity, whatever it is. The great thing about creativity is there is not really any wrong. You can explore it until you get better at it, or you can be happy with what you do for you, unless it's me singing.
So Dominic, there's a great comment there from Ulysses Moreno Serena in the chat saying that, I mean, not to judge, less artsy judging and more creative praising, I think is, which is really what you're saying, is let the child, let the person express themselves, don't judge it.
Gracias. Que hay una invitación a colaborar. Dices, gracias, Brian y Dominic, por sus presentaciones. Las disfruté mucho. Actualmente estoy desarrollando una propuesta para adultos mexicanos con diabetes en el contexto de grupos de ayuda mutua en unidades de atención primaria. Y me gustaría integrar el arte terapia en el proyecto. Me encantaría compartirla con ustedes y buscar la manera de colaborar. Atentamente, Alejandra Jiménez.
Yeah. That sounds very, very interesting. I think it's likely to be of great benefit. I mean, to them in many, many different ways in terms of, I suppose, awareness education, but also in terms of benefit for many of the symptoms or complications they may be experiencing. So it'd be very interesting to see that, and wish you the best with it.
And also those projects are quite often, they're really beneficial for staff. They make your work a little bit more fun. They make your day a little bit more interesting. If you're doing the same thing with the same patients, a little bit of variety is a magical thing.
Un comentario, gracias, excelente seminario, magníficos ponentes, una necesaria reflexión para nuestro día a día. Alejandra Poblano nos pregunta, ¿qué tan valioso o importante podría ser una intervención artística con niños con autismo o neurodiversos en pro de una mejora en su comunicación y socialización? ¿Cómo sería bueno abordarla?
Dominic,
Where
over to you, Dominic, because I mean, I've had the pleasure of going with Dominic to a setting where people with neurodivergent were flourishing in the context of creativity and arts, but particularly music. But Dominic, you probably describe it a lot better than I could.
Yeah, it's if I worked in tourism in Dublin, it's one of the places that I would take people so they can see how lovely things that happen in the city. So this is a very simple part of the city. It used to be a very poor part of the city, less so now. It used to have a big problem with drugs and social issues, less so now because people are older. But it has, like so many of those areas, an unexpectedly large percentage of people with disabilities, multiple kinds of disabilities. And so maybe 10 years ago, in the local community hall, a group of women decided that they would make a food bank, but they were worried about stigma and issues. And so they started a free breakfast, really for isolated men that lived in that area. Often men that had been in the army that came back to this, and they lived in the flats in this area. And so that's where this began. It was a free breakfast for these men. And then it became a free breakfast for anybody who needed a free breakfast in this community. And they used to play a bit of music, and there'd be a bit of a DJ, and there'd be an argument about the kind of music, lots of involvement about the music. And then gradually over time, they discovered that somebody played guitar and somebody played drums, and then there was a band and people would play, and then they started to teach each other. And so now if you go to this, there is some food, there's lots of conversation, there's lots of jokes, there's lots of music, there's a lot of karaoke, not very good karaoke, but really, really, really passionate. And everybody gets to play. And it's so simple. It's so relatively cheap to do, and it's sustained itself now because it's a source of great joy for that community, and from that have grown many other different projects. At one point I worked there to make a project between that group of musicians with disabilities and the National Symphony Orchestra. And so the symphony orchestra would go to the breakfast and play in the breakfast, and that people from the center would go to the hall, and over time we made a really beautiful piece of music about what was important in life in that community. So I guess there isn't any one answer, but there are lots of examples now, and I think examples are fantastic. In my work, quite often it's not data that we need or research, it's an inspiring example. So what happens is people get curious, they get very excited and inspired, and if they can then pick up the skills, they make their own version, and then we have a virtual circle where these projects develop and grow. There are beginning to be lots and lots of projects, and also artists traditionally, many of them are on some sort of neurodivergent spectrum, and art is how they can communicate. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots of examples of all kinds of different artists who art was the place by which they could make sense of the world and communicate with other people.
Y dos comentarios de la Coordinación de Salud Mental. Dice, escribo de Morelos, México. Felicito a ambos ponentes. Gracias por compartir sus conocimientos y experiencias. Después de escucharlos, tengo el soporte teórico para impulsar la creatividad y el arte como factores protectores de la salud mental poblacional. Mil gracias. Y el último comentario, bueno, uno de los dices de Ulises Moreno, dice, es tan importante que quienes enseñan arte, especialmente en contextos comunitarios, adopten un enfoque distinto, menos juicio estético y más reconocimiento a la creatividad. Y finalmente, las felicitaciones, gracias por compartir y por motivar. Gracias, Brian, Dominic, Tere.
Bueno, pues con esto vamos a dar cierre al seminario del CIEE, el seminario mensual, que fue un seminario muy exitoso, innovador dentro del ámbito del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. Y bueno, ahora nos queda que en el Día Mundial del Cerebro tenemos que darle salud. Nunca habíamos pensado que la creatividad es parte de la salud mental. Así que los invito a seguir promoviendo la salud cerebral. Muchas gracias al doctor Dominic Campbell, al doctor Brian Lawlor, y esperamos poder contar con la colaboración permanente de ellos. Muchas gracias y muy buen día.
Gracias. Para cerrar, este seminario celebró la convergencia entre ciencia, arte y salud pública, reconociendo que el arte puede fortalecer el bienestar emocional, la conexión social y con ello la salud de nuestro cerebro. Necesitamos prácticas y intervenciones que fomenten entornos que sean protectores del cerebro a lo largo de la vida. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Que este encuentro nos inspire a seguir trabajando juntos para promover la salud cerebral desde la colaboración, por supuesto, la sensibilidad y la creatividad. Esperamos contar con ustedes en futuras actividades. Hasta pronto.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.